December 18, 1944. Inside a frozen foxhole near Alvada, Corporal Mark Miller pressed his headset tighter against his frozen ears. Through the crackling static, he heard something that made his blood stop. A German panzer commander giving coordinates. Not to his own tanks, but to American positions. Mark's hand hovered over the transmit button. He'd been ordered never to broadcast on enemy frequencies, a court-martial offense. But 300 men were sleeping 2 miles west, right where those tanks were heading. Mark closed his eyes, opened his mouth, and spoke perfect German into the void. This is the story of how one radio operator saved a battalion by breaking every rule, and why the Army tried to bury what happened next. Before we go further, if you love untold stories of forbidden wartime ingenuity, hit that subscribe button. You won't find these stories anywhere else. Mark Miller wasn't supposed to be listening. The U.S. Army Signal Corps had strict protocols about radio monitoring. Operators were assigned specific Allied frequencies. They relayed messages up the chain. They maintained equipment. What they did not do was tune into enemy transmissions without authorization from intelligence officers. The reasons were practical. First, it wasted time and resources on chatter that trained interrogators should handle. Second, it risked operators being fed disinformation. Third, and most critically, it could lead to unauthorized responses that compromised operational security. But Mark had never been good at following rules he didn't understand. He'd grown up in Detroit, the son of German immigrants who'd fled Europe in 1923. His parents spoke German at home until Pearl Harbor made it dangerous. Mark learned the language at his grandmother's knee, absorbing not just vocabulary, but idioms, regional dialects, the particular rhythm of Prussian German versus Bavarian. By the time he enlisted in 1943, he could mimic accents from Hamburg to Munich. The Army tested his German during basic training. They marked him fluent and assigned him to signals intelligence. But instead of sending him to a cozy desk job in London translating intercepts, some bureaucratic mix-up landed him with the 82nd Airborne as a field radio operator. He fixed equipment. He relayed coordinates. He spent most of his time cold, wet, and bored until the bulge. When Hitler launched his desperate winter offensive on December 16th, the American lines shattered. Entire divisions were encircled. Communication networks collapsed. In the chaos, Mark found himself in a foxhole outside Alvada with a functioning SCR-300 radio, a pair of high-quality headphones scavenged from a destroyed German half-track, and nothing but time. So he started listening. At first, it was just curiosity. He'd spin the dial through the spectrum, picking up fragments of German chatter, tank crews reporting positions, infantry calling for ammunition, artillery observers adjusting fire. Nothing actionable, nothing he could do anything about. Just voices in the dark, men speaking his grandmother's language while trying to kill his friends. But Mark had a gift. Not for languages, though that helped. He had a gift for patterns. Before the war, he'd worked for Detroit Edison as a troubleshooter. When electrical systems failed, Mark would listen not to what people said was wrong, but to the hum of the equipment itself. Transformers had rhythms. Circuit breakers had personalities. He could hear problems before they became catastrophic. Now sitting in frozen Belgian mud with German voices crackling through his headset, Mark began to hear patterns again. There was a panzer commander who always said "moment mal" before giving coordinates. An artillery spotter who pronounced Feuer with a slight lisp. A logistics officer who ended every transmission with Indy in a bored monotone. Mark started taking notes. He sketched crude maps based on unit designations he heard. He logged transmission times, frequencies, call signs. Within 3 days, he could recognize individual German operators by voice alone. He knew which panzer battalion was operating northeast of Alvada. He knew their fuel situation was critical. He knew their commander was cautious, methodical, and terrified of mines. On the 4th night, December 18th, Mark heard something that made him sit up straight. The cautious panzer commander, the one with the smoker's rasp, was receiving new orders. Mark's pencil flew across his notepad as he transcribed. The words were mundane, tactical, professional, but their meaning was apocalyptic. The German column was being redirected. New target, a fuel depot 2 miles west, the same depot currently surrounded by American infantry who had no idea they were about to be crushed by 40 tanks. Mark's hands shook as he looked at his notes. He needed to warn someone. He reached for his transmitter to call headquarters, then stopped. His orders were explicit. Monitor Allied frequencies only. Report through proper channels. Do not engage with or respond to enemy communications under any circumstances. But proper channels took time, verification, approval chains. By the time his warning crawled up to someone who could act on it, the German tanks would already be grinding through American foxholes. Mark stared at the captured German radio set in the corner of his foxhole. It had been sitting there for 2 days, pulled from a destroyed set KFZ-251 half-track. He'd kept it thinking maybe intelligence would want it. But intelligence was miles away, and the panzers were moving now. Mark made a decision that would change everything. He reached for the German radio and began adjusting frequencies because sometimes the only way to save lives was to become the enemy. Mark had been listening to the Panzer commander for 72 hours straight, and in that time the man had become more real to him than most of his own squad. He knew the commander's rhythms. The slight pause before announcing coordinates, as if double-checking a map. The way he said jaw with a downward inflection when acknowledging orders he disagreed with. The barely audible sigh when his superiors demanded impossible timelines. The commander's call sign was Eisenkral 4, but Mark had started thinking of him as Hans. There was no reason to believe his name was Hans. It just felt right. Hans sounded tired. Hans sounded competent. Hans sounded like a man who'd been fighting too long and wanted to go home, but would do his duty anyway, because that's what men like Hans did. Understanding Hans wasn't just academic curiosity. Mark had realized something crucial about German radio discipline, or rather the lack of it. The Wehrmacht's communication doctrine was rigid, hierarchical, and terrifyingly efficient under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. The Battle of the Bulge had stretched German logistics to breaking point. Radio operators were exhausted. Equipment was failing. And in their desperation to maintain coordination, the Germans had started cutting corners. They rarely authenticated transmissions with proper code sequences anymore. There wasn't time. Instead, they relied on recognition, on knowing their officers' voices, on the familiar cadence of orders delivered in the same format they'd heard 1,000 times before. It was faster, it was practical, and it was a catastrophic vulnerability if someone like Mark happened to be listening. Mark had filled an entire notebook with observations. He'd mapped the transmission schedule. The Germans followed predictable patterns. Hans usually received orders between 0200 and 0300 hours. His radio operator had a distinct click when he engaged the transmitter, probably a worn component in the press-to-talk switch. The officer giving Hans his orders always began with the same phrase, Eisenkral for here, Panzertrupp Kommando. More importantly, Mark had identified the emotional patterns. Hans was confident when discussing defensive positions. He became hesitant when orders required aggressive maneuvering in uncertain terrain. And he was absolutely paranoid about mines. Every time orders took his column through unfamiliar territory, Hans would request clarification. Is the gap proofed? Is the route verified? He'd ask it twice, sometimes 3 times. That paranoia made sense. Mark had heard enough radio chatter to know Hans had lost 2 tanks to American minefields in the past week. Good tanks, experienced crews, gone in seconds because some intelligence officer misread a map or ignored a reconnaissance report. Hans wasn't going to let that happen again if he could help it. But there was something else Mark noticed. Something subtle. When Hans received orders he trusted from officers he knew, his responses were crisp and immediate. But when orders came from unfamiliar call signs or seemed tactically questionable, there was hesitation, a pause, a request for confirmation. Hans was professional, but he wasn't blindly obedient. He questioned things carefully, respectfully, but he questioned. That should have made Mark's plan impossible. How could he fool a man who questioned his own superiors? But Mark understood something about psychology that most people missed. Suspicious people aren't suspicious of everything equally. They're suspicious of anomalies, of things that don't fit the pattern. But if you match the pattern perfectly, if you sound exactly like what they expect to hear, suspicion never triggers. The brain simply accepts the familiar and moves on. Mark had been running scenarios in his head for days. What if he could transmit orders that sounded exactly like the ones Hans expected? What if the call sign was right, the format correct, the accent perfect? What if the orders themselves were tactically reasonable, just subtly redirected? Hans wouldn't question familiar patterns delivered in familiar ways. He'd simply obey. The ethical weight of what Mark was considering grew heavier with each hour. He wouldn't just be breaking army regulations. He'd be engaging in psychological warfare without authorization, potentially compromising intelligence operations, and risking catastrophic consequences if he failed. If the Germans detected the deception and triangulated his position, they'd rain artillery on his foxhole until there was nothing left but a smoking crater. But more than that, Mark was planning to deceive a man he'd come to understand, maybe even respect. Hans was the enemy. Hans's tanks would kill Americans if given the chance. But Hans was also a human being, a professional soldier doing his job, and Mark was about to exploit his trauma about minefields to send him to his death. Mark stared at his notes as snow began falling again outside his foxhole. The moral calculation was simple and horrible. Hans and his tanks versus 300 American infantry who had no idea they were about to be annihilated. There was no good choice. There was only the choice that saved the most lives on his side. On the evening of December 18th, Mark's ethical debate became irrelevant. His command made the decision for him. Captain Sterling appeared at his foxhole with 2 MPs and an expression like granite. Someone had noticed Mark's unauthorized monitoring. Someone had reported it up the chain. And now everything was about to fall apart. Captain Sterling didn't waste time with pleasantries. He stood at the edge of Mark's foxhole, snowflakes gathering on his shoulders, and held out his hand. "Give me the headset, Corporal." Mark's stomach dropped. He pulled the headphones off slowly, the German voices still crackling faintly through the speakers. "Sir, I can explain. You've been monitoring enemy frequencies without authorization for 4 days." Sterling's voice was flat, controlled, the kind of control that came before explosions. "You filled notebooks with intelligence you had no clearance to collect, and you've been using a captured enemy radio set without reporting it to command." One of the MPs climbed down into the foxhole and began disconnecting Mark's equipment. The SCR-300 went first, then the German headphones, then the precious notebook filled with 4 days of observations. Mark watched his work disappear into an equipment bag like watching someone dismantle his life. "Sir, you don't understand. There's a Panzer column." "I understand perfectly, Corporal." Sterling cut him off. "You're a radio operator, not an intelligence analyst. We have trained personnel for signal interpretation. What you've been doing is dangerous, unauthorized, and potentially compromising to operational security." Mark's mind raced. He needed to make Sterling understand. "There's a German commander call signed Eisenkral 4. He's been receiving orders tonight. He's moving on the fuel depot west of here. 300 men are sleeping there right now with no idea." "Enough." Sterling's jaw tightened. "Do you have any idea how many false reports intelligence receives every day from well-meaning soldiers who think they've cracked the German code? Every private who speaks a little German thinks he's going to win the war from a foxhole. This isn't false, sir. I've been tracking him for. You've been listening to radio chatter you're not trained to properly interpret." Sterling gestured to the MP who was now collecting the captured German radio. "For all you know, you've been listening to a deception operation. The Germans know we monitor their frequencies. They feed us disinformation constantly." Mark felt something breaking inside him. Not anger, something colder. The realization that Sterling wasn't going to listen, wasn't going to check, wasn't going to do anything except follow protocol. "Sir, please just verify the intelligence. Send a runner to the depot. Tell them to expect contact. That's all I'm asking." Sterling studied Mark for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was almost gentle. "Miller, you're a good radio operator. You've kept our communications running under impossible conditions, but you've crossed a line. You will cease all monitoring of enemy frequencies immediately. You will not discuss your unauthorized intelligence gathering with anyone, and if I hear you've touched enemy equipment again, I will have you court-martialed. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." The words tasted like ash. "Good. Get some sleep. You look like hell." Sterling turned and climbed out of the foxhole, the MPs following with Mark's confiscated equipment. Mark sat in the sudden silence of his foxhole, feeling the weight of helplessness. The German radio was gone. His notes were gone. His ability to monitor Hans's transmissions was gone. And somewhere out in the darkness, 40 German tanks were preparing to roll over 300 sleeping Americans. He tried to tell himself Sterling would follow up, that intelligence would check the threat, that the system would work the way it was supposed to work. But Mark had been in the army long enough to know better. Sterling would file a report. The report would be added to a stack of other reports. Intelligence would prioritize threats based on source reliability, and an unauthorized corporal's warning would rank somewhere below credible. The snow fell harder now, muffling sounds, turning the world into a monochrome painting. Mark pulled his coat tighter and tried to think. There had to be a way. Some proper channel he hadn't considered. Some officer who would listen. Then he heard it. Voices. American voices drifting from a supply trench 30 yards away. Two officers talking as they passed. Mark couldn't see them through the snow, but sound carried in the cold night air. Pulled every available man for the defense perimeter. Fuel depots practically empty now. Smart. If the Germans break through, better to have the men than the diesel, assuming the Germans even know where it is. That sector's been quiet for 2 days. The voices faded. Mark sat very still, processing what he'd just heard. The fuel depot wasn't just undefended. It had been deliberately stripped of personnel. Command had gambled that the Germans didn't know its location. They'd bet 300 lives on the enemy staying ignorant. But Hans knew. Mark had heard the coordinates himself, and in approximately 4 hours, Hans would receive his final orders, and 40 Panzer tanks would turn west toward men who'd been deliberately left exposed. Mark looked at the corner of his foxhole where the captured German radio had sat. Gone now. Confiscated, locked away somewhere, but not destroyed. Equipment like that would be sent to intelligence for analysis, which meant it was still on base somewhere. Mark had never stolen anything in his life. He'd never directly disobeyed an order. He was the son of immigrants who taught him to follow rules, work hard, keep his head down. But sitting in that frozen foxhole, knowing what he knew, Mark realized that all his life he'd been preparing for this moment. The moment when following rules meant watching people die. He waited until 1:30 hours, until the guard rotations changed, until exhaustion and cold dulled the attention of men who'd been fighting for weeks. Then Mark climbed out of his foxhole and disappeared into the snow. The supply depot was a collection of canvas tents and wooden crates arranged in what optimistic planners called organization. Mark moved between the shadows, his breath forming small clouds that dissipated in the falling snow. He'd spent 3 months on this base. He knew which paths the sentries walked. He knew which tents held ammunition and which held equipment awaiting intelligence review. The captured German radio would be in the CI tent, counterintelligence. A glorified storage area where confiscated enemy equipment sat waiting for someone with proper clearance to examine it. The tent was guarded, but not heavily. Who would steal a broken radio in the middle of a war? Mark crouched behind a supply crate and watched the guard. Young kid, probably 19, stamping his feet against the cold. Every few minutes, he'd turn and walk 10 paces in the other direction to maintain circulation. 10 paces away from the tent entrance. 10 paces of opportunity. Mark waited for the turn, then moved. He slipped under the tent flap and found himself in organized chaos. Lugers, binoculars, helmets, maps, all tagged and cataloged. And in the corner, his German radio sitting in a crate marked for transport to London. He grabbed it and was out in 15 seconds. Back in his foxhole, Mark's hands shook as he checked the radio. Still functional. The Germans built equipment to last. He extended the antenna carefully, checking for damage. None. The battery level was low, but sufficient. He had maybe 2 hours of transmission time before the power died completely. Mark pulled out a scrap of paper and began writing. Not the transmission itself. He couldn't script this. If he sounded like he was reading, Hans would know instantly. Instead, Mark wrote phonetic guides, reminders of how Panzertrupp commando officers structured orders, the rhythm, the formal military phrasing, the specific terminology. Eisenkral for here. Panzertrupp, no, Iron Fist for. This is Tank Group Command. New orders. Mark whispered the phrase over and over, adjusting his accent. Too sharp, and he'd sound Bavarian. Too soft, and he'd sound Austrian. Hans's command structure was Prussian, Northern German. The accent had to be Berlin, maybe Hamburg, clipped consonants, precise vowels. He practiced the commander's speaking pattern. Panzertrupp officers were former aristocracy mostly. They spoke with the confidence of men accustomed to obedience. Not loud. Volume wasn't authority, but absolute certainty. Every word delivered as indisputable fact. Mark recorded his practice runs in his head, listening for flaws. He sounded close, but not perfect. The problem was obvious. He'd learned German from his grandmother, from shopkeepers, from working-class immigrants. He'd never learned the aristocratic military dialect. He was trying to mimic a social class he'd never belonged to. But he'd spent 4 days listening to Hans's actual commanders. He could hear their voices in his memory, the particular way they pronounced coordinaten, the slight emphasis on the second syllable of Angriff. Mark closed his eyes and let those voices wash over him until his own voice began to match. The technical aspect was simpler. Mark needed to know the exact frequency Hans would be monitoring. That information was in his confiscated notebook, but he'd memorized the key frequencies days ago. 43.4 MHz, the standard Panzertrupp commando channel. The harder question was timing. Too early, and Hans might receive contradictory orders from his actual command. Too late, and the panzers would already be moving toward the fuel depot. Mark needed to transmit during the narrow window when Hans expected orders, but before the real orders arrived. Based on 4 days of observation, that window opened at 0217 hours. Hans's actual orders usually came between 0230 and 0245. Mark would have roughly 15 minutes to broadcast fake orders, have Hans acknowledge them, and get off the air before the real Panzertrupp commando came through. 15 minutes to save 300 lives or destroy his own. Mark checked his watch. 0203 hours. 14 minutes until he committed the most serious breach of military law short of desertion. Impersonating enemy command. Broadcasting on enemy frequencies without authorization. Conducting unauthorized psychological operations. If caught, Mark would face court-martial, imprisonment, possibly execution, depending on how the tribunal interpreted his actions. But if he succeeded, 300 men would wake up alive tomorrow, and 40 German tanks would drive straight into American minefields based on orders from a voice that didn't exist. Mark adjusted the frequency dial with numb fingers. The radio crackled to life, German voices bleeding through the static. Somewhere in that electronic chaos, Hans was listening, waiting for orders he didn't know were about to come from a foxhole 2 miles away. Mark pulled his coat tighter and began his final preparation. He whispered German commands into the darkness, feeling the words shape his mouth, his throat, his accent. He imagined he was the commander, Prussian aristocrat, tired but professional, delivering orders that would never be questioned because they sounded exactly like every order Hans had ever received. At 0216 hours, Mark picked up the microphone. His hand was steady now. The fear had burned away, replaced by cold focus. He was about to speak and the world would change. He keyed the transmitter and waited for the red light. When it glowed, Mark opened his mouth and became someone else entirely. Eisenkrawfer here. Panzertrupp Commando. Mark's voice cut through the static with the precision of a blade. He'd pitched it slightly deeper than his natural register, adding the gravelly authority of a man who'd spent 20 years commanding tanks. The German words felt strange in his mouth, not because he didn't speak the language, but because he was weaponizing it. Silence. 5 seconds of nothing but atmospheric hiss. Mark's heart hammered against his ribs. Maybe Hans wasn't monitoring yet. Maybe the frequency was wrong. Maybe. Panzertrupp Commando, here Eisenkrawfer. Bereit. Hans's voice, the smoker's rasp. Mark nearly dropped the microphone in relief. Tank Group Command. This is Iron Fist 4. Ready to receive. Mark forced himself to pause. Real commanders didn't rush. They spoke with the certainty of men whose words would be obeyed without question. He counted 3 seconds, then keyed the transmitter again. Eisenkrawfer, Neue Befehl. Iron Fist 4, new orders. Your current attack route is being changed. Another pause. Mark could hear Hans breathing on the other end. That detail sent ice down his spine. He'd listened to this man for so long that now, separated by miles of frozen forest and the thin membrane of radio waves, Mark could sense his confusion. Route change. Understood. Reason for the change. Hans was questioning, not refusing, just seeking clarification. This was the moment, the inflection point where Mark's performance would either convince or condemn. He needed to give Hans a reason that was tactically sound, aligned with German operational doctrine, and most importantly triggered Hans's deepest fear. Aerial reconnaissance has identified minefields along your original route. American engineers have reinforced defensive positions in the last 12 hours. Mark held his breath. Mines. The word that made Hans hesitate every single time. The trauma of watching crews incinerated by buried explosives. Mark was exploiting that trauma, manipulating it, using a man's fear to send him toward death. The pause lasted 7 seconds. Mark counted every one. He could imagine Hans in his command tank, looking at maps, weighing the intelligence against his orders. Suspicious people weren't suspicious of everything equally. They were suspicious of anomalies. But this wasn't an anomaly. This was exactly the kind of last-minute tactical adjustment that happened constantly in fluid combat. New route, please. Mark's hand shook as he reached for his makeshift map. He'd memorized the coordinates of American minefields northeast of their position. Real minefields laid by real engineers. He was about to send Hans directly into them. Except Hans would believe he was being routed around American defenses, not into them. Course changed to 035. Reference point Hartmann 7. New target coordinates to follow. Mark rattled off a series of grid references, each one carefully chosen, each one leading Hans's column exactly where it needed to go. Not toward the fuel depot, not toward 300 sleeping Americans, toward ground that hadn't been contested because both sides knew it was lethal. Coordinates confirmed. And the new target. Mark had prepared for this. He couldn't just redirect Hans without giving him a target. That would be suspicious. The target needed to be valuable enough to justify the route change, but not so critical that Hans would request additional support. American supply column lightly defended. After taking the target, hold position and await further orders. The beauty of the lie was its modesty. Mark wasn't promising Hans a game-changing victory, just a minor tactical objective, something believable, something that wouldn't trigger Hans's instincts that he was being set up for something catastrophic. Eisenkral understood. Iron Fist 4 will execute order. Estimated arrival 0530. Confirmed. End. Mark released the transmit button and sat in absolute silence. His entire body was shaking now, adrenaline flooding his system in waves. He'd done it. Hans had accepted the orders without significant questioning. In approximately 3 hours, 40 German tanks would roll into American minefields believing they were flanking an ambush. But Mark didn't feel victorious. He felt hollow. He'd just sentenced men to death. Hans would die. His crews would die. They'd die believing they were following legitimate orders, never knowing they'd been deceived by an American corporal in a frozen foxhole. Mark quickly buried the German radio under loose dirt and equipment, camouflaging it from casual observation. If anyone found out what he'd done in the next few hours, his life was over. But more immediately, the real Panzertrupp Commando would try to contact Hans at 0230. When they did, Hans wouldn't respond because he'd already received his orders. They'd assume radio trouble. They'd try again. Eventually, they'd realize something was wrong. Mark stared at his watch. 0224 hours. In 6 minutes, the real German commanders would begin transmitting. In 3 hours, the minefields would explode. And somewhere between now and dawn, 300 American soldiers would wake up alive, never knowing they'd been saved by a voice in the static. At 0532 hours on December 19th, 1944, the first explosion tore through the frozen Belgian countryside with enough force to wake soldiers 3 miles away. Then came the second, then the third. By the time the cascading detonation stopped, 12 German Panzer tanks had been destroyed, and the pre-dawn darkness glowed orange with burning fuel and ammunition. Hans died instantly when his command tank triggered a Teller mine. The blast punched through the thin belly armor and ignited the fuel tanks in a fraction of a second. He never knew he'd been deceived. Never knew the orders came from an American foxhole instead of German high command. In his final moment, Hans believed he was executing a legitimate tactical maneuver to avoid an ambush that didn't exist. 23 other German tank crew members died in the first 30 seconds. More would die in the hours that followed as American artillery, alerted by the explosions, rained fire on the trapped column. By dawn, the entire Eisenkral battalion had been effectively destroyed, not by superior American tactics or overwhelming firepower, but by a voice that convinced them safety lay in the one direction that guaranteed their annihilation. 2 miles west, 300 American soldiers woke to the sound of distant explosions. They grabbed weapons, manned positions, prepared for an assault that never came. When reconnaissance units investigated at first light, They found the burning wreckage of a German armored column in a sector where no engagement had been planned or authorized. The intelligence reports that followed were confused, contradictory. German tanks destroyed in American minefields they should have known to avoid. No evidence of American forces in the area. The Germans had simply driven into certain death as if following orders to do so. Some analysts suggested radio malfunction. Others proposed the German commander had suffered a mental breakdown. The true explanation never appeared in official documents. Mark sat in his foxhole and listened to the explosions echo across the frozen landscape. He didn't feel relief. He didn't feel pride. He felt the weight of what he'd done settling into his bones like the Belgian cold. He'd saved 300 American lives by taking German ones. The mathematics were simple. The morality was not. Captain Sterling appeared at Mark's foxhole 3 hours after dawn. He didn't come with MPs this time. He came alone carrying Mark's confiscated notebook. The captain's face was unreadable as he climbed down into the foxhole and sat across from Mark in silence. Finally, Sterling spoke. Intelligence found something interesting this morning. A German panzer column destroyed exactly where your notes said they'd be. Except they weren't supposed to be there. They were supposed to be attacking the fuel depot. Mark said nothing. The German radio we confiscated from you is missing from the CI tent. Disappeared sometime around 0130 hours. Sterling paused. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Corporal? Mark met Sterling's eyes. No, sir. Sterling studied him for a long moment, then looked down at the notebook. These notes, this intelligence, it saved lives. A lot of lives. He set the notebook on the dirt floor between them. But what you did, if you did it, was completely unauthorized. Impersonating enemy command is a serious offense. If the Germans had detected the deception, they could have triangulated your position. You'd be dead. Anyone near you would be dead. Yes, sir. You put yourself and potentially others at risk for an operation that had no oversight, no backup, no authorization from anyone with the authority to authorize it. Sterling's jaw tightened. That's not heroism. That's recklessness. Mark nodded slowly. You're right, sir. Sterling stood up, brushing dirt from his uniform. I'm writing a report stating that the German column was likely deceived by Allied psychological operations. I'm recommending you for a commendation for your intelligence gathering. He paused at the edge of the foxhole. I'm also transferring you to a signals unit in Luxembourg, effective immediately. I don't want to know what you did or didn't do last night, but I never want to see you near enemy radio equipment again. Understood? Yes, sir. Sterling climbed out of the foxhole, then turned back. Miller, those 300 men who woke up alive this morning, they'll never know your name. There won't be any medals or parades. This will never appear in any official history. Can you live with that? Mark thought about Hans, about the smoker's rasp he'd never hear again, about the men who died believing they were following their commander's orders. I can live with it, sir. Sterling nodded once and disappeared into the morning light. Mark Miller spent the rest of the war in Luxembourg, far from the front lines, maintaining communication equipment and training new radio operators. He never told anyone what happened in that Belgian foxhole. After the war, he returned to Detroit, married, raised 3 children, and worked for the phone company until retirement. He died in 1987 at the age of 64. In the decades that followed, military historians occasionally noted the strange fate of the Eisenkral 4 Battalion. Some speculated about psychological warfare operations. Others dismissed it as wartime chaos and coincidence. The truth remained buried in a frozen foxhole in a voice that spoke perfect German into the static, in orders that came from nowhere and saved everyone. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold tales of World War II's invisible heroes. Because sometimes the most important battles are fought not with guns, but with the courage to break every rule when lives depend on it. Mark Miller never fired a shot in combat. But on one frozen December night, he fought the most important battle of his life, armed with nothing but a captured radio, for days of observation, and the willingness to become the enemy long enough to save his friends. In the end, war isn't always won by those who follow orders. Sometimes it's won by those who understand when to break them.